Hi, my name is Nobel in Trouble, and I'm here to inspire you, motivate you, and energize you so you can live to your fullest potential. Today, I want to share with us on the subject of personality. So, personality is something that we grapple with. A lot of us grapple with. A lot of us struggle with the question of who am I? How am I showing up? What's my personality default? And what does that say about me? How does that shape who the things I do and how I interact with people? Now, personality is very crucial for all of us. Personality is who you are, that's no doubt about it. It's how you show up, it's how people perceive you, it's how people interact with you, it's how people learn to deal with you. However, when you are not aware about your personality, it can be very confusing for you, first of all, and then, of course, for the people that you interact with, the people that you work with. And so, how do you understand your personality? How do you get a better definition of your personality? Who are you as a person? Why do you do the things you do? What has shaped you into the person that you are today? And that's what I want to talk about in this video. So, in understanding your personality, today I want to share with us 5 things that basically shape and define your personality or your persona in terms of how you are showing up. So, yes, your personality is a default setting in many ways. However, your personality has also been shaped by your environment and the way you have been conditioned. So, in understanding your personality, you'll need to understand all these 5 dimensions that contribute to your personality and how you show up. The first dimension of our personality is understanding your birth position. Now, that's a whole topic of its own. There's very limited information, but there's a bit of information online in understanding how your birth position and your gender position does define your personality and how you show up. Now, there's extensive research about things like common traits for firstborn children, for lastborns, for middle children, and there's a lot of information that you can read about. So again, the other thing is that it's a combination of birth position and gender. So the idea that I'm talking about is the fact that the firstborn male that is followed by boys is going to be very different from a firstborn male that is going to be followed by girls. As much as both of them are firstborns, they are going to have some common traits. However, they're going to be very different because of the gender positioning. A boy that follows a girl or a girl that follows a boy is going to be very different. So again, in understanding your personality, I'll encourage you to read about one, your birth position. Are you a first child, a second child, a middle child, a last child, and what does that say about you? And then the second thing, I also want to read about your gender positioning. So the firstborn of boys, the firstborn of girls, or the lastborn of boys and things like that. And to see how that plays out in shaping your personality. That is a critical piece of information that I'm not able to delve into, but there's a lot. If you begin to Google and research, you'll find it. But our birth position and gender position does influence our personality in so many ways. And the second aspect in understanding your personality is what I'll call the involuntary conditioning. So your conditioning as a child, where you grew up, the schools you went to, the people you interacted with have shaped you into the person you are. So what are some of those things that you grew up hearing or experiencing? What did you see the adults in your childhood do? Those things have had a huge impact on how you think, on how you see the world, on how you're going to respond to situations, and that inevitably begins to form your persona or your personality. So your involuntary conditioning, why do I call it involuntary? Because as a child, you don't have so much of a choice to choose the kind of conditioning you go through. If you were raised by disciplinarians, you have no choice over that. That's how you're going to come out as a child that was raised by disciplinarians. If you were raised by absentee parents, it's going to shape and condition you a certain way, and you really don't have so much of a choice over that. So that's what I call involuntary conditioning. And so thinking about your childhood, especially your early childhood experience, research has shown that the personality and the character of a child is shaped between the ages of 0 to 7. Now that's a wake-up call for parents to think about what are you investing in your child between that age. Now oftentimes as parents we want to think that children at the age of 4 and 5 do not understand. We want to begin having conversations when they reach the age of 9 or 11 or 12, and sometimes that's a little too late because their persona and default character has been shaped. So thinking about the things that happened in your early childhood and infancy stages and how that has shaped you into the person you are. It's interesting that sometimes the things that our parents conditioned us to do long after you have left their home and your family, you still do these things. It's like you hear your mama calling out some of these things, or you hear, your father or your grandmother, whoever you grew up with, screaming or telling you the same things. And right now they're not there, but it has conditioned you into the person that you are. The third aspect of what shapes our personality is exposure, which I'll call voluntary conditioning. This is voluntary because it happens so much for you as an adult. As an adult, you choose the things that you want to be exposed to. This could be the books you read, the movies you watch, the places you travel to, and how all this begins to shape the way you see yourself and the world. It also begins to shape the way you show up. By default, there are things that you have done as a child, but when you begin to get exposed, when you begin to travel, when you begin to read, there are things that you begin to critique yourself about, and then you begin to readjust your persona. You begin to readjust your personality to fit into society, to fit into community, to do the things that are acceptable in the context of where you are. So voluntary conditioning, or what I'll call exposure, is another aspect that basically informs and shapes our personality. I'll give a very simple example. Many people say that when you travel, especially as an African, you begin to keep time. Well, there's something about African times, like we have all the time, and the European and the developed countries have all the watches. That's a joke people say about it. But for anyone that has traveled and has had to deal with people in developed countries, in Europe or the US, you realize that there's a lot of things that will pass in your local context, in your country, that will not pass when you travel. So oftentimes when you travel, because of the exposure you have had, you come back more cautious about time, more cautious about being on time, or even arriving earlier than the stated time. And that becomes a default setting that becomes a part of your personality. And people will see you as rigid, as uptight when it comes to time. But that could be because of a voluntary conditioning that happened through exposure. The fourth perspective that shapes our personality is environment, and what I would call adaptation. So sometimes we do adjust to our environment. You go to a place and realize everything everything that makes you comfortable, everything that is natural with you is not acceptable, and you begin to make the necessary adjustments. You begin to adjust to your new environment. You begin to adjust to the new place where you are, or rather I would say to adapt. The thing about human beings that in so many ways we are like animals, we adapt to our environment. It is also interesting to note that there are people who will say, I am outspoken naturally, but when you put me in a certain environment, I go quiet. So that is part of adaptation. Sometimes your personality and your persona, you will show up a certain way in certain places. Or if you have been exposed to a particular place or a culture, maybe it is not within your innate persona to show up on time, but you're working at this job where it is expected of you to always show up before the stated time if you want your job. So you can adapt to that character to a point where it actually becomes a default setting for you to actually show up on time. Now, that is part of exposure, adaptation, that you did not necessarily want to be that way, but because you needed a job, you began to adapt, and then you got so caught up in this adaptation that it became part of your second nature. So that's what I call adaptation. And the fifth perspective that shapes our personality is what I call the seasonal persona, especially for us women. We do go through phases, especially with our menses, where your hormones are erupting and disrupting and doing all kinds of things, and you find a person who is bubbly, suddenly they're depressed, they're low, they're quiet, and they can't even explain it. So again, before you say, this is who I am, you might want to step back a bit and analyze what's going on in your life, what's going on in your space, what's the season of your life, because sometimes we show up a certain way because of the season we are going through, and that is normally a temporary persona. So what that does, if someone analyzes you in that part of your life, you're going to realize that you're going to come out very differently. So 5 things that will help you understand your persona. 1 is your birth and gender position. 2 is your conditioning as a child, which I call involuntary conditioning. 3 is exposure, or what I call voluntary conditioning. 4th is adaptation, and 5th is the seasons of your life. These 5 things basically shape how you show up and how you present yourself in different circumstances and at different points of your life. So how do you get to know your personality? Now, to better understand your personality, you need to test it out. And there's so many personality tests. When I say many, there are really many. Now, I like the simpler ones. The simpler, the better for me, because then it makes it easy for me to understand myself and the interpretation of my personality. I will suggest that you can take a couple, maybe one or two, just to compare, and then see if that sounds like who you are. Now, the thing about personality tests is not about giving the right answers. It's about being authentic and spontaneous as you can. When you read the question, respond to it without thinking whether this is the most appropriate answer, but rather respond to it as, yes, this is my default setting, or my first instinct to for this question, this is it. That is how you're going to get a very authentic representation of your personality test. And then when you do your personality test, reflect, does that look like who you are? And then I've also had cases where people say, I did the test and it does not represent who I am. I normally say it could be a seasonal persona. So you did it in a certain frame of mind. Maybe you are scared, or you're anxious, or you're going through a season. I'd normally say, do it a couple of times and see if it keeps changing. Normally, it's going to be consistent and constant. The other way to test your personality is after you've done your test, ask the people that know you very well, the people that are very close to you. Ask them a simple question. How would they describe you? This could be your family members. This could be your closest friends or your workmates, your colleagues, the ones that you work with more closely. Ask them and say, how would you describe me in all honesty? Now, the thing is that you want them to give you their perspective of how they perceive you, and there's no offense in how they perceive you. It's only a reflection of how they see you show up. So that means sometimes as individuals, in your head, you have an idea of who you are. You have an idea of how you need to show up. But then the people you're interacting with perceive you a certain way. Why? Because there is a mismatch between what's in your head and what's happening on the ground. So when you do your personality test, that's one thing you can do. Second is cross-check whether it does reflect in how people perceive you. Because your personality could be very strong, but because of the different conditioning or adaptation, you might be showing up as a different way, and so people are perceiving you differently. But what you want to see is that there's a connection, at least with your family and closest friends. There should be a very close link. They should be able to agree to some of the things that describe your personality. And then the third thing, of course, is for you to analyze if it's a seasonal personality shift or it's something that is permanent. And how do you do that is you can take the test periodically. I wouldn't say every day, every week. Give it time. Give yourself time and take the test again and see if it's going to resonate with who you are. Personality is very crucial for each one of us. It's a default that we live with, and yet it does affect our confidence. It does affect our esteem. So the critical thing in building your esteem and confidence is, first of all, understanding yourself, understanding who you are. Why do you do the things you do? Why do you care about the things you care about? And how are you showing up? Which is reflected in how people perceive you, because how you show up is very critical to your personal image, to your self-image, in spite of how you think about yourself and how you perceive and know yourself to be. My name is Involuntary. Have a blessed day and a blessed week, and I'm happy to have these conversations and to share some links to personality tests and any other resources that I might have a hold of. Have a blessed day. God richly bless you.